and what I at least tell you guys what I do. She said, my name is Lisa Ames, and I am the homeowner insect and weed diagnostics lab. Now this, that should be, they kicked the Griffin off, so now it's just la.ega.edu now. Some of my slides I have been changed, and some of my haven't. Some of my talks I haven't, some I haven't, but the address is correct and the phone is correct. And what happens here is extension agents send homeowner insects to me. So I'll identify generally homeowner insects. However, I'll also identify insects for some of the local pest control professionals that will bring them to me, especially ones that have come to our class, because we have a class too for pest control professionals. And so I'll get some insects from them, but I'm not supposed to get them directly from homeowners, and there's a good reason for that. That's to discourage them from just bringing me, samples all the time just off of a whim. And then also there are some people that if they get, there is a thing called delusory parasitosis, and Dan unfortunately has a case right now where they've found out where his office is, and they bring him what they think are insects, but they aren't really insects. So that's something we discuss in our pest control professional class, because it can be a real problem. If they treat these people's houses, not only are there no insects there, well, they might be happy for a couple days or maybe a week, but then of course the bugs are going to come back, and now they've got themselves in a vicious cycle where they have to they're obligated in some cases to keep going back and treating these insects that aren't there. So that's one of the reasons why I typically only get things from extension agents. That's to protect the public and me, so that what my recommendations go through someone else before they're told to everybody else and you guys. But all the insects that we've got today, all that to say that a lot of these insects that you're going to see today are all ones that have come into my lab at some point. And the interesting thing about household insects, or at least the stored product ones we're going to be focusing on today, is each year is different. A lot of extension agents ask me, well, why don't you make us a nice bulletin so that we can tell us what insect should we be looking for this spring, or what insect should we be looking for this fall? Well, in most cases that changes every year. Every year we get something different. A couple years ago we had acorn weevils that were coming into people's houses. Haven't seen them since. 5 years ago we had certain caterpillars that were coming into people's houses and invading people's houses. We haven't seen them since. Every year it seems to be something different. So it changes every year as to what I get. But stored product pests never change. Every year we get stored product pests. So they're one of the constant things that we get. So it's a good idea to be familiar with these, especially if you're going to be helping with identification, because they come in every single year. We get stored product pests. So first off, why do we end up with pests inside our home? And in most cases, if they're not stored product pests, a lot of them wander in by accident. Most of the pests that we get, most of your occasional invaders, your spiders, except for domestic spiders, they come in accidentally. And I say it should have accident in quotation marks, because in a lot of cases they are attracted by lights. A lot of insects are attracted to lights. If you have lights right outside your exterior doors and the insects come there and fall on the ground, you're going to increase the chances of them getting inside. So in a lot of cases that can be, especially winged ants. When ants reproduce, they create winged forms of themselves. These fly into the air and mate and come down. Sometimes they will mate at night, sometimes mate at night, and they can be attracted to lights. And you can have just hundreds of winged ants that will be attracted to these lights and fall down. And that's often when we get a case of winged ants coming into people's houses. If they're not an English species, and they're usually not, this is where they're attracted from. Now, the stored product pests we're going to be talking about today, most of them hitchhike inside. And typically they come in on groceries, and I should say not groceries that not only food, but pet supplies, pet food, and birdseed. Birdseed actually a big one, and we'll talk about that later. Now, there are some species that come in on purpose, like Dan talked about, these smoky brown cockroaches, and they actually do come in on purpose if the conditions inside are good, as we talked about. But today we're going to be talking about the ones that come inside, that hitchhike inside mostly. And I don't have a dot. I have a star, so that's a bit. And also, when you get a test question from me, in most cases, it's not going to be about specific species. It's going to be about the group in general. So, why do household pests survive inside a home? Well, in most cases, they want water, shelter, food, and they like favorable temperatures. But most of the temperatures that we live at are perfectly fine for most insects. But water is actually a big one for a lot of critters. You know, the cockroaches, the ants, a lot of them, some of them are coming in for water. And some of them actually like shelter. Dan talked about the bed bugs. They come and they feed on you and then they go away to shelter somewhere else. However, when we talk about stored product pests, we throw all that out the window. Stored product pests don't need any of those things except for one thing, food. They don't need any extra water. They don't need extra shelter because they live and eat in their food, and the favorable temperatures you've already provided in your home. So actually there's only one thing that you can take away from a stored product pest to get rid of them, and that's their food source, because that's all that they need. Now, as I mentioned, they're brought in the home in groceries or supplies, pet food, and bulk items especially. That big bag of dog food, that big bag of bird seed. And that's because the bigger something is, the longer it takes to use, and the longer it sits around, the longer that these things right, as you say, it can take a while for the population to build up. So what happens is, you're not noticing them. Now, most of these things are really tiny, and I've actually brought some live specimens here today so you can see how small they actually are. So you're not going to see them. You might get a lot of complaints from homeowners. They might call up and say, all of a sudden I have all these moths flying around my house, or all of a sudden I've got all these beetles. Well, it might seem like that to the homeowner, but it's very unlikely that they all of a sudden showed up. They were probably there for a long time, living inside this bag of dog food or this bag of bird seed, and the homeowner didn't notice them. And that's because many of these guys are mobile. Many of these pests they fly. Most of them fly. There's one that doesn't, but most of them fly. Some of them are attracted to lights, and because of that, they can spread throughout the house. So as soon as they leave what they're feeding on, they can spread throughout the house rather quickly. Now, all this information that I'm going to be telling you is going to be in a stored product bulletin, which I unfortunately put down here where I can't reach. And I'll show you and it is available online. So this is what it looks like. I'll pass it around. And it has almost all this information and most of the pictures that we're going to be talking about today. So at least most of it. So therefore, you won't have to worry too much about writing down little minute details, because it's all going to be inside that bulletin. And here's the site. So there's the site where you can get it. And you can get both of them here at this publications. In this case, you want to put in stored product pest or bulletin 1378, and this will pop up. And it's called Stored Product Pests in the Home. And this is going to discuss the identification and control of all these things that we talked about today. And it's got 16 pages with information and photos. So and it's available in color online. It's both in PDF form and right off of the site. Now, the second one, the one that Dan passed around earlier, that one's only available in PDF form, but this one is available both ways. And so all the things that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk about sanitation, all these particular pests, they're all going to be in here. So, in fact, most of these pictures are too. And this is what it looks like. That's what, when you get to the site, this is what you're going to see, and then you can actually pick and choose by clicking on those things that will take you to the sections that are in that publication right away. So let's talk about where you find stored product pests. Well, here's a pantry, and I used to say a typical pantry, but somebody pointed out and said, well, that's much too neat to be a typical pantry. Believe me, it doesn't look like this anymore. Oh, do you want to say something? Oh, I get to raise my hand. Okay. So what you can see that might be a little bit different, though, is you might notice plastic containers here. And that's because in most cases, when I open something, if it's something I think a store product pest is going to eat, although I put it in this kind of a plastic container, or I put it in one of those big Ziploc bags. Because once you've opened something, it makes it much more easy for a store product pest to get inside. And I've had a couple of store product pest infestations in my day, and I'll tell you exactly how I got them when we get to that point, so you'll know what to avoid in the future. I get bugs, so you don't have to, hopefully. But this is a really good way. Now, the interesting thing to know here, you might know, because it can be a pain, I might know here. All right, here I've put instructions, because of course once you take it out of its container, now it doesn't have instructions anymore, so I have to do that. Sometimes I tape it on. But what you might notice here, even with this one here, even though it's sealed really nicely, there's a space right there. And that's going to become an issue when we come to one particular kind of pest. It's very small and flat and can actually fit in those spaces and wait for you to open up the top, and then it'll fall back in. Now, there are some things that they won't necessarily eat, and I don't even worry about. For example, instant potatoes. I don't even bother protecting those. Nothing seems to want to eat those, so I don't worry about that. No insects. I've never seen an insect infestation in those. But there are certain things that they definitely prefer. Crackers, cereal, those are prime things that they like to eat. Sometimes oatmeal, rice, and those are definitely the biggies there. Cookies too, those are the big ones. But they'll also eat a lot of other things, and we'll talk about that next. So, some common sources. How do you get these things to start with? Well, as I mentioned, birdseed is a big one. And that's because if you think about it, birdseed back when I was a kid looked pretty much all the same. You know, there were some different brands, but it was all that little millet seed, and then you had some large sunflower seeds and maybe some of those other seeds. But that was about it. But nowadays, you have all different kinds of bird seeds that contain cracked corn, pre-shelled sunflower seeds, fruit, nuts of all different kinds, and all these things are things that store product pests love to eat. These are all perfect for them to eat. So all you need is a great big bag. I've actually brought home bags of birdseed before that have had 3 different species of store product pests in them. So what I generally do is keep them outside. I keep them on the carport in one of those big aluminum trash cans with a lid on it. And you'll see why in a minute, because they're sneaky, and we'll talk about that. They can also come in dry dog or cat food. So you might have these large bags of dry dog and cat food that you might get. And if you can think about it, nowadays you don't just go to the pet store and get the food anymore. You go to these big warehouse stores. And so the dog food can be on the pallets when they come into the distribution center. They can be on pallets right next to the birdseed. And you can get cross-contamination rather easily. So this is one of the reasons why nowadays, since all of these things can be together under one roof, you can get cross-contamination. So, and also if you get, sometimes those dog foods and cat foods, especially if you have to get, like when my cat was older, I had to get, some specialized cat food for it. Those can be expensive. And if you buy the little ones, they're more expensive, so you buy the great big ones. But of course, the great big ones are going to sit around longer. So that's one of the sources that can come from. You can also find them a little bit less often in cereals and crackers and cake mixes and such. But more often, depending on what it is, dried beans and peas are another one. I actually had brought home some split peas once that were infested with one of the weevil beetles we'll talk about. And the reason why is if you think about those packages, they're plastic, but they have small holes in them so that that they can be put on top of each other, and little larvae can get into those holes rather easily. And you don't always use those right away, right? Beans and peas, you think, oh, they'll last forever, and they usually do, unless you have to get insects inside them. So typically, when we have a peas or a beans infestation, it's usually in clumps. Like you'll get one place that had been infested, and then multiple homes will get beans from that source, beans or peas from that source. So, but we have some unusual sources also that you might not think about that store product pests like to eat. And tobacco and chocolate are one of them, especially chocolate. If you think about baking chocolate and chocolate bits, they'll definitely get in there and eat those. This was a case, this was dried peppers that a lady brought home that a lady brought into me, and they were ones that she had taken from her own garden and dried and put in plastic bags. They were pretty hot. I'm not a pepper aficionado. I don't eat hot food. I'm from New England. So we don't eat much hot food. And I don't remember what kind it was exactly, but it was a pretty spicy kind. They didn't care. They ate the whole thing. They chewed them all up. And this particular kind, this is a drugstore beetle we'll talk about in a minute. They also tend to like spices. In fact, typically when you have a drugstore beetle infestation, the spice cabinet is probably where it originated. So this particular one likes to eat lots of spices. But they'll also eat some other things, like dead insects. There are certain kinds, there's one group called the domestic beetles, which feed on dead insects. And what I mean is they're dry dead insects. So say, for example, you had a bad infestation of box elder bugs or ladybugs, and you killed them in your wall, and they all fell down, and now you've got a bunch of dead insects down there. The other insects will come in. As soon as the active ingredient wears off, other insects will come in and feed on those dead insect bodies. And as soon as they're done eating, then they're going to be coming in looking for something else to eat. And another one is rat bait. Rat bait has a different active ingredient. It doesn't affect insects. It only affects rats. So I've actually had people send me photos of rat bait that was still in the package that was getting eaten by insects. It hadn't even been taken out of the box yet. That insects had eaten holes in the box to eat the rat bait. So here's kind of, you don't have to write all this down. This is just showing you that this is all different kinds of edible food that these things can eat. And pretty much we've covered them in there, and it's going to be covered in that bulletin. So everything we've talked about here. But the interesting thing is there's just as big a list of non-edible things that you might not think of. So this is the problem. These stored product pests will leave the kitchen and they'll go to other areas of the home and eat other things that aren't necessarily food. So you might not think of looking for the stored products there. And these, the biggest one recently is grid eggs. That's the big one that we have been finding recently. We've been getting cases of grid eggs. And does everybody know what grid eggs is? No. Okay, for the grid eggs is it's this box of stuff that you use for your septic system, and it's bacteria that feed and enzymes and things that feed on, but it's put onto like a wheat base. So what happens is the insects are eating the wheat base that this thing was on. And of course, you're not going to find the grid eggs necessarily. Probably not in your kitchen. It's probably going to be in the bathroom, downstairs in the basement. So if the insects find this, it could start an infestation there. Well, there's some other things that they can feed on. We already mentioned the bird seed and the dried pet food, but animal products such as pig's ears and raw hides and dog bones. With dried fruit peels or dried beans or feathers. They love feathers. There's some that love feathers. And the interesting thing is anything that's your bean bags are actually filled with beans, or those little things that you used to, like what they call them, the draft cards, those little things that go along, and usually those are filled with rice. That's another thing. They can find that and feed on that. And as we already mentioned, the dead insects and rat bait too, they'll feed on. Oh yes, and your Indian corn. Don't forget your Indian corn. They'll eat that too. So, some important considerations. The adults are small. Some of them are long-lived, and some are attracted to lights, and so that means they can disperse. So what does this mean? As we mentioned before, this means that for many people, the kitchen is one of the first places where the lights are turned off. So then if they'll fly to, say, I've had some people collect them in night lights in the bathroom. They'll go to the windows in the kitchen, in the living room, and they'll go other places where there's light. The unfortunate thing is in Georgia, it's very common for a lot of these rooms to have wood floors, right? So the first thing that homeowners think of when they find, okay, they find beetles on the windowsill in the house, they think they're coming from the wood floor or they're coming from the windowsill. And in fact, about 90% at least, maybe even more than 90% of the insects that I get that homeowners think are wood-eating beetles are actually stored product pests that have come from the kitchen. It's amazing. So it's a very common thing to find the stored product pests in other areas of the house, even before they're found in the kitchen. In fact, some homeowners are very surprised to find out that these are stored product pests because they haven't found them in the kitchen yet. And remember, the adults are the dispersal stage. They're mobile, and that means that they're the ones that are going to start new infestations. So it's the adult beetles. And because they're a point source, that means the problem solving is inspection driven. That means homeowners have to find all the sources of the pest. There's nothing else. They might ask you, what can I spray to get rid of this problem? And the answer is nothing. No, nothing. Because you're not going to be spraying your food and you don't want any chemicals near your food. So there's nothing that they can spray to get rid of it. Now, they may be able to use traps, and we'll talk about those later, to monitor and tell where the problems are and see if they've got things under control, but there really isn't anything to use because these adults are just the dispersal mechanism. The actual problem is still in there somewhere else where the larvae are feeding on the food. And I'll show you all pictures of all these larvae and things to get there, at least most of them. So here's our first guy. These are the drugstore beetles. These are the ones, these were the ones that were feeding on the peppers. So the interesting thing about these, and this is one of the big ones that's most commonly confused for a wood destroying beetle, and that's because there is a species of wood destroying beetle. In fact, if they go and look at wood destroying beetles, it will probably pop up. It's in the same family as these guys. So it has the same, see these kind of little fuzzy hairs on it, on the wing covers, and the lines that go down, and the head that's tucked underneath. Also, the problem is they tuck these antennae underneath a lot too. They look an awful lot like this. They're just a little bit bigger. So if they look up wood destroying beetles, beetles that eat your home, wood beetles, they'll come up with pictures that look very similar to this, and they'll think they've got a wood destroying beetle. Well, this is how you tell them apart. Wood destroying beetles do not have antennae with these three. It's called a plug. So see, there's 1, 2, 3 larger segments there. This is how you tell the difference. The wood beetles will not have that, even though they might look almost exactly like this. They won't have antennae like that. So that's one of the ways you tell the difference. And and these guys will fly to lights. So as I mentioned, they might leave the kitchen, go into places where there is wood and be confused for wood destroying critters. The interesting thing though is in general, the wood guys, the wood destroying beetles that look like this are generally down in the basement because they feed on your pine, and they're the ones that get into the crawl space and cause all the, so they're typically not going to be in the same place. The only way that they might kind of overlap, or you might find it, is maybe in a basement that has, again, wood eggs or something like that downstairs. Typically, the habitats of these are not going to overlap of these beetles. And as I said, all of this stuff is going to be in one of the bulletin. It's going to talk about these and their things. So, and as you mentioned, this is what they'll do. They're often going to be found in the spice cabinet first. And I don't keep my spices with the rest of my food. I have a special spice cabinet right next to the stove where I want to use all my spices. So they can eventually get over into the cabinet, but if they look in the pantry first, the drugstore beetle, it's very important for finding the source of these guys. And they'll also, here's some they're one of the ones that will eat the pet treats. So here's a pet treat. Here's a dog bone and all those little holes that they've eaten. They've eaten by the drugstore beetles. We have a colony right now that's actually feeding that's eating a bunch of. We have them on dog bones. And the interesting thing also, these and the wood ones, oftentimes about 20%, more than 20%, almost probably 30% now, of the samples that I did get in come with little hymenopteran parasites. So they come with little parasites. And the problem is these little parasites can be mean. They can sting. They can actually be kind of aggressive. But they actually come with, and that often tells you that your population is pretty well established if you've also got little hymenopteran parasites with them. And it's very common for the drugstore beetles for that to happen. It also happens with the wood beetles as well, but the wood beetles don't have, their parasites are wingless. Even though they're in the same group or similar, they don't have wings, whereas these guys will have wings. They don't fly very well though. They tend to do a lot of hopping, even though they fly. Now, cigarette beetles, I'm going to mention these not because they're very common. They actually aren't very common except locally, but they're in that same family that the drugstore beetles are. However, they have, you can't see it here, but they have serrated antennae like the wood beetles do. So to tell these guys apart, they have smooth, they don't have any, remember those grooves we saw before on that other guy? These guys do not have grooves, they're very smooth. So there's a complex of 3 of them. They're all in the same family group. If in doubt, send them to me, because you don't want to be saying, oh, you have a wood destroying beetle that can be extremely expensive, that can be extremely expensive to control. And if it's just a stored product pest. So if in doubt, send them to me. You don't want to have that kind of mistake. It can be an expensive mistake, depending on what the treatment would be if there's a bunch of them there. So that's how you tell the difference between all of them. This is also not a very common one, but I put it in there because it also looks like certain kinds of wood destroying beetles. It can be confused for what's called a lichted powder post beetle. Those are the ones that eat your wooden floors. That are sometimes found in wooden floors, popping out of wooden floors. They typically don't reinfest because the floors are already, or they can, but it's very difficult because the floors are already stained or painted or sealed. But these guys do look an awful lot like them, and oftentimes when I do get these, the homeowner thinks that they're lichted powder post beetles. They very rarely think or realize that they have flower beetles. Because again, these guys fly. In the southern states, we have what's called red flower beetles rather than the confused flower beetles, and our species flies. So again, can be attracted to lights. These guys have serrated antennae, and it's typically going to be feeding on very processed foods. This particular store product pest, it's got to have like really fine, like flour, cake mix, something very, very fine. So that's going to at least help with these guys. Unlike the drugstore beetles, which could eat all sorts of things, these guys are going to be more easy to narrow down. They're not going to be in your cereal or your cookies. They're going to be eating something extremely processed and fine. Okay, our next guys are the sawtooth grain beetles. Now these guys don't fly, but they're very small and flat. So these are the guys, remember in the very beginning I showed you that container with the little hole in it? These guys are able to sit there and wait because they're so small. They can get in really tiny packages. They're like 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, really small. And what happens is if you open the container, they can fall in and restart the process all over again. Now, of course, if it's flour or something like that, you can typically see them falling in. But if it's cereal or oatmeal or something, you don't realize there's a whole bunch of them in this photo. So let me show you here. So here you can see there's some, these are grain, these are oatmeal grains. And then if we look one more time, there might have even been more than you might have thought originally. Yeah, there's a lot of them in there. And there's probably more I didn't even put. There's one right there too that I didn't even circle the ones over there. So these guys are really small and they can hide really well. And this kind, even though they don't fly, they make up for it by the adult can live up to 6 months, which is a long time for an insect adult. Usually insect adults don't live that long. So what they lack in wings and being able to fly, they can make up for they live a long time and they can crawl a pretty good distance in that time, you can imagine. So they will be feeding in that time. So these guys do feed as adults, and that lets them go on, and that means that they can stay around the longer an infestation can. You have to be more careful with these guys because you have to make sure you exclude them for a longer period of time than some of the other store product pests that they have. And here's what they look like. Here's what they look like enlarged. And they're really easy to identify once you put them on a microscope. They're called sawtooth crane beetles because they have right here on their thorax, they have the little teeth that look like the blades in a saw. And they also have, again, the same lines that the other guys do, but these guys are all made up of little dots. So they've got parallel lines of small dots all along their wing covers. So they're pretty easy to identify if you find them. Not so easy to get rid of. Now I'm going to talk about warehouse beetles. And is there something unusual in this picture that you haven't really seen for any of the other insects yet?
In various stages, I guess.
Well, no, well, also all that stuff. See how that's their larval skins. So these guys, this group of guys, these are the domestic beetles, and they leave their skins behind. So they don't eat them when they molt. They don't eat the skins. They're left behind. They're kind of fuzzy. For some people, if there's a lot of them, they can cause a problem, not asthma problem, but they can cause allergies. They can cause allergies if there's too many of them. But that's one of the ways that shows you that you have a potential warehouse beetle infestation. They can also chew out of cardboard and probably chew in as well. The interesting thing there is that they're not necessarily feeding on that's a box of macaroni. I mean, they might be feeding on the macaroni, but more likely they're probably feeding on the flavor packet. So they're eating the meat flavoring or the cheese flavoring, or they're as much or more after that as they are the macaroni. The domestic beetles are like that. So they'll feed on a wide variety of items. And the problem is the adults, and it's the larvae sort of, but mostly the adults resemble carpet beetles. And so here we'll show you, here's a close-up of the little larvae. And what you can see is, and I think even here you can see, they've got the little tufts, see the long tufts of hair coming out the back. Now the back part of their body is darker, and then they've got really long tufts coming out. That up there is an adult. And the interesting thing is this happens a lot for warehouse beetles more than other things. You notice that the adult is almost smaller than some of the larvae. I don't know why that's the case, but that often happens. At least the ones that you find, there might be larger ones, but you typically don't find them. So if you see that and it's small, you're not necessarily going to think, oh, it's attached to these things. But that's the case. Even though they look different and those are larger, these are the same. They are all the same thing. They're all warehouse beetles. And as I mentioned, though, they do look, here's the adult, here's a close-up. And it's got a pattern on it. And these are like little scale things. The problem is those scales will come off fairly easily. So that can be a problem sometimes for identification, mostly because here's what the larvae of the larvae, here's the warehouse beetle with those little tufts that come out back. That's a very carpet beetle larvae. Now they look kind of similar, but these guys don't have the tuft that's coming out the back. And they're a little bit different. They're a little more dumpy, while those are a little bit longer. And this for me is helpful. This is actually how I'd rather have a larva tell them apart, because for me, here's what the adults look like. All right, so here's the adults. And yeah, the coloration is a little different, but remember, those are scales. And once they die, if they get any kind of rough treatment at all, those scales start falling off and they get darker. Also, these are called varied carpet beetles for a reason. And that's because they do vary quite a bit in terms of, this happens to be a lighter one, but actually you can find that some that look an awful lot more alike than the others. So typically I like to have a larva because I have an easier time telling the larva apart than I do the adults. Warehouse beetles are a little bit bigger, but they do, again, as I said, overlap in size. And the reason why you're going to want to know the difference is, and when we get to carpet beetles a bit later, carpet beetles happen everywhere. Carpet beetles are out in the environment. They're very common. They feed on pollen, they feed on fallen hair, and they're pretty much, they typically just do kind of clean up in the house. So most houses have a few of them. If you have a lot of carpet beetles, there's typically something else going on. And I'll talk about that when we get to the carpet beetles. But for the most part, they're not a problem. They're easy to get rid of as soon as you find the point source. The problem with the warehouse beetle is because they eat so many things and they have some adaptive, some things that are they have an adaptive habit that I'm going to talk about in a minute. They're a much bigger problem. And that adaptive habit is, if we go back to the larvae here, these larvae, if they can't find something to eat, they'll just stop their development. And they don't die. They just sit there and wait until more food comes along, and then they continue on again. And also, they're very prolific. If you look at a colony of very carpet beetles and a colony of warehouse beetles, if you feed them the same kind of thing, the warehouse beetles are going to multiply much more quickly than the carpet beetles. That just happens to be the way that they are. So typically, that's why warehouse beetles can be a problem. Now, the rice or maize weevils. These guys are fairly easy to tell apart. If you get them under the scope, they have 4 red spots on their elytra. You might not be able to see them as well here. They're easier to see on the screen, but usually you can only see those under the scope. But they also have some other really interesting characteristic, the way they look, and that's their little weevil snout. They have a typical weevil snout, the long weevil snout. Also, if you poke them, they'll play dead. They'll fall down, pretend to be dead. That's typical of these guys. Now, one helpful thing about these guys, though, they will feed only on grain, mostly whole grains, or at least they have to have something substantial. So, like grain, like corn or rice or wheat. Or this, I've had a case of these in split peas before, but still, even though they're split in half, you've still got a pretty, a hard half. That's what these guys need in order to survive. They can feed on other things, but they can't reproduce unless it's, so that at least narrows down where you're looking for them. They're going to either be in the rice or the corn or your split peas or something like that. Typically, they can't get into beans. They're too hard, so they're going to either be in the corn or the rice or the split peas, typically. Although I have heard of them getting into vanilla wafers before. I guess vanilla wafers are dense enough for them to get into, but that's an unusual case. So that's typically what's going to happen with these guys. They can survive pretty good. The adults can, but they're not quite as long-lived as the sawtooth gray beetles, but they're fairly long-lived. However, because they can get into corns and grains like corn and rice, especially the corn, these are going to be the ones that are going to be found. One of the ones that's going to be found in bird feed. They can also get into deer corn. They can get into corn decorations. Your harvest decorations. They're going to get in there. They're going to get into the rice that's filling up the draft thing. So these are ones that typically can be in other areas of the home than the kitchen that the homeowner might not think of, and that might cause other infestations to keep going because they've got a source that's not where the homeowner would think it would be. Now we have the cowpea weevils. These guys are similar in that they only infest whole kernels. However, these guys are on legumes only, so you're only going to find these in your beans and garbanzo beans and cowpeas and all those kind of. And I guess that's a little kidney bean or something there. Typically, they're very lots of eggs, very prolific, and they're rather robust. They have their legs are one way. They have a spine on legs, but they're very robust. Their wings don't cover their whole abdomen entirely, and I'll show you a close-up of them in a minute. Now, these are weevils per se, or they used to be weevils. Now they're back into the leaf beetles because they don't have the typical beetle snout. They might play dead, but they're actually fairly mobile. You wouldn't think they are, because they are kind of big. They are kind of robust, and it looks like their little wings wouldn't be able to, but they're actually very mobile, and they can fly very well. and this is a problem. So again, because they get into beans, they will typically get into some things that aren't necessarily food. They'll get into bean bags, they'll get into things like that. In this case, we had some that we got into some bean decorations, that some lady had some little balls made, the decorative balls made out of beans, and they were all infested with cowpea weevils. Were getting into eating them all up. So that's typical for these guys, and there's all these pictures are actually in that bulletin, that 1378, that stored product pest bulletin. So now here comes the biggie. This is actually the most common of the stored product pests. Typically, if someone is going to get stored product pests, this is going to be your first guess. And the interesting thing about these, you've not noticed everybody else we've been talking about before has been beetles. Now this is our first, this one, however, is a moth. And because it's a moth has larvae, and moth larvae have a very interesting behavior that the beetle larvae typically don't have. And that's called a wandering behavior. So what happens is when the larva is about to pupate, it's going to turn into a pupa, it often leaves the area where it was feeding on and crawls off somewhere else to pupate. They'll actually do this outdoors. A lot of your outdoor caterpillars will do the exact same thing. So they're moving away from what they're feeding on. And because of that, and because the adults, even though they fly, they often are active in the evening or at night, oftentimes the larva is the first stage that the homeowners will see. It'll crawl up to their wall or it'll crawl up the pantry. And typically, we get a good look. I think I have the next one is a pretty good look at that. No, we're going to look at the adult first. The adult is very typical. It doesn't look like your moths, that most of your moths that you see outside at the light at night. It is this typical, very narrow shape, and it has a copper area, it has a black band, and then it has a lighter, it has a cream colored area, and that's very typical. Even a pretty beat up moth will show this kind of you can still see this kind of a pattern on them. However, as we mentioned, and here, this is what they leave behind. They, like the domestic beetles we talked about earlier, they have their own signs of infestation, and that's going to be, this here is webbing. So here's all the silk on the top of this is a thing of oatmeal, a container of oatmeal, and you can see the webbing on there. They'll do the same thing in cereal. This is when you dump your box of cereal and all the flakes don't get in the bowl because they're all hanging all hanging from the webbing. That's typically these guys. Now the interesting thing about this is here we take a closer look at the larva, and that's because the larvae are white. They kind of inch along, and even though they have a head capsule, oftentimes homeowners call that they don't know that they have an Indian mealy-moth larva. Sometimes they think they have maggots. Okay, and they'll call up and say, I have a bunch of maggots crawling up the wall. Well, that's your first clue. Maggots do happen, but they don't crawl up. Maggots, when they do happen, they usually come from the ceiling and they fall down. So typically if something is crawling up, it's going to be an Indian mealy-moth larva. I had one poor lady a couple years ago. She had an Indian mealy-moth larva infestation and gotten rid of it. And she found a bunch of things crawling around on the floor, on her kitchen floor, and she thought, oh no, I have another infestation, but she sent them in and it turned up they actually were maggots. So she did not, the good news was she did not have an Indian mealy-moth infestation. The bad news was that she probably had a little dead critter in the attic. So good news and bad news there. Typically, the one's going to go away a lot faster though. The Indian mealy-moth is a big pain in the Have any of you guys had an Indian mealy-moth infestation before? They're really difficult to get rid of. And I think that's because of that wandering behavior that we talked about. So when they wander away and pupate, and I think, I don't think the beetles do this as often, but moths, especially if it's later in the year, what do a lot of moths do over winter, right? They overwinter. So now you can have this pupa sitting in your cabinet up where you can't see it because they've crawled away. and you think you've gotten rid of the infestation, and then hello, 5 months later, spring happens, and you've got a few more moths. Now, not all of them are necessarily overwinter, but the ones that do can restart the infestation all over again. And that's the only thing that the adults do. They don't feed. The only thing that they do is to go find something else to reinfest. That's lay eggs and reinfest. That's their only purpose in life. So this is why Indian moth infestations can be very difficult to get rid of, because you might think you've gotten rid of it, and then you might become a little bit lax at covering your food, and these guys get right back inside again. And they're really good at getting in any kind of open package. They're really good at getting back inside, getting inside. So just for the contrast, we will show you what the larval flies look like, so you can tell the difference. As you notice, the larval flies do not have a head. So you don't see that head capsule that you saw with the Indian moth larva. They don't have any real legs either. And so they're typically going to look, this is what they're going to look like. They're going to look different than the Indian moth larva. And this is what they become. Of course, they're going to become the adults. That's what they're going to become. And usually it's dead animals in the attic is the most common one. Every once in a while, you might get a trash receptacle, and that usually happens with somebody went on vacation, a couple went on vacation. I thought you put out the trash. I thought you put out the trash. Well, unfortunately, very similar to Indian meal moths, flies also will move before they pupate, and they have a really fast life cycle. So within a week, they can have eaten, crawled out of the trash receptacle, gone over to the wall and pupated, and even though, you got rid of the trash receptacle, some of them escaped and went elsewhere. So they also have a wandering behavior, same thing. That's how they end up in the downstairs in the kitchen. So if they're coming out of the attic, they start crawling away and they get through the light fixtures. And the kitchen has more than some of the other areas of the house. Not only is that typically where the pest is going to be potentially, but that's you're going to have all the fans that are going from the oven and the light fixtures and the ceiling. And so there's going to be more outlets to the attic, and that's typically when they fall down in there. Not always. Sometimes the maggots don't make it down there, and all you see are these flies. All of a sudden, you've got a bunch of these, and you're like, where did these flies come from? That's probably where they came from. So now we're going to talk about forgotten bird seed. All right, and this is a biggie with Indian meal moths. All right, this was a batch of bird seed. It was shelled black oil sunflower seeds, and this was we had a storage shed. We lived in an apartment in Indiana. This was an outdoor storage shed. So what happens, the apartment has one of those, balconies that you go out on, and out on the balcony, remember, Indiana, there's an outdoor storage shed. So we figured out, we leave it out there, be no problem. We're gonna have winter, everything's gonna be good. Nothing's gonna happen. We'll get our photographs and we'll be all set. What we didn't realize, because it makes no sense, at least to me it doesn't, this outdoor storage shed on the balcony outside in Indiana had a vent that connected inside. Now, why you would want that when it's like, 20 below in Indiana, why you would want a vent that would go outside the house, I have no idea. However, of course, it was a storage shed. We had a bunch of stuff stored in front of it. However, the Indian meal moths found it, and they got in the vent and went into the kitchen. So remember, just because you think you're safe and you've got your bird seed and things like, say, out in the garage, if there's a shared some kind of vent there that you didn't know was there, that was put there during the building process, the Indian meal moths are going to find it. And they're going to get inside. So just remember that, and always be careful. Just because you throw the bird seed in the garage doesn't necessarily mean the house is safe if they have a way to get out of that bird seed and get into the house proper. So always remember that.
Bare feet? I'm sorry.
That's my hubby. I don't do bare feet. Now that's my shoe, however. See, because this is at the time in Indiana, I worked in stored products. And also, well, those are my herbicide, but those are my work boots, and we had to have steel-toed boots in order to get under the corn bins and things. So, yeah. So my shoes, dance feet. Okay, so how can you tell if you have a problem? Now, the good thing about Indian meal moths, or at least pheromone traps are available in most of your home improvement stores. So you can go get any moth pheromones traps, and you can put them in your kitchen. But remember, only the males are attracted to these. So it's not going to solve your problem for you. It's going to tell you how big a problem it is. It's going to help a little bit, but all it takes is one or two males to escape, and they can mate with a whole bunch of females. And once she's mated once, she's set. She can just lay a whole bunch of eggs from that one mating. So it's a good indicator thing, but that's about it. That's what it does for you. Also, they need to be able to hone in on this pheromone trap. So you should only put one, unless you have a really huge kitchen. You don't want to be putting up a whole bunch of pheromone traps, then it actually won't work, because all the pheromone in the air will just be confusing, and they won't go to the traps at all. They'll be totally confused. They won't be able to zero in on that one pheromone, on a particular pheromone trap. It's just too overloaded senses. So always remember, all you need is one, and unless you have a really big kitchen, then maybe two, but mostly typically one, and only the males are going to be attracted to these. So, how do we control stored product pests? You might notice we have a couple things here, but one is highlighted. The most important thing that the homeowner is going to have to do is locate the source of the problem. And actually sources of the problem. Because as I said, they can move, and they might be in not only different areas of the pantry, they might also be in the spice cabinet, and they might be in other areas of the home with non-consumable things that they still will eat. Now, what the homeowner can do in the meantime, while they're trying to find these things, if they find something and they don't want to throw it away, and I've had people say, ew, why would you want to throw it away if it's good for us? Just throw it. Well, if you have a great big bag of, that you spent, of prescription dog food that you spent $40 on, the dog's not going to care. If it doesn't come back, you can throw that in the freezer, and as long as although I would suggest at least a week, these things, you want to make sure you kill them, you're okay. You can do that. Or if you have some, a favorite holiday decoration, you can throw that in also in the freezer and kill them, and you don't have to worry about it. But the idea is, not only do you want to put the infested items there, it's also a great place to store things that are open, that you don't want things to eat. They will not be able to complete their development in the refrigerator, and especially not the freezer. So those things that you can put in the refrigerator, if you have a nice big refrigerator, mine tends to always be full, so there really isn't any room for that kind of thing. But so I usually go for the sealed containers and the big Ziploc bags. So that's usually what I use. But that's the number one important thing, is you got to find them. Even if you take everything else and put them in containers, you still got to find all the sources. So there's not going to be any way to get around. The homeowner's going to hate it, but you're going to have to tell them they're going to have to look through it. It might take a couple hours, depending on how big your pantry is and how much stuff you have in there. Mine would take a couple hours if I have a bunch of stuff in mine. Then you have to do that. Also, other thing, use items on a first in, first out basis. This can also be a pain. You've gone grocery shopping after work, and there was a big sale, and you bought a whole bunch of stuff. And now the last thing you want to do is go in your pantry and pull all the old stuff up front and put the new stuff in the back. You just want to stuff it all in there. However, the older a package is, especially when you're talking about things that have, in cardboard boxes and such, the weaker the cardboard starts to break. One, the cardboard starts to break down. It's easier for things to chew in and out. And two, if there is an infestation in there, it's going to keep building up. And now it's not only is it left longer, but now it's in the back of the cabinet where you can't see it. So first in, first out basis is a really good idea. Or as we talked about that, so here's just breaking that down. So here's your things, and there's that items that what we talked about. It's dark and they can multiply unobserved. And that's ideal harborage. If they're left there unused. Because not only is it dark and they're able to, but they're not being disturbed. They're just being able to do everything that they can do. they have it nice and humid, and they're not getting disturbed. And also, the sealed container should have tight lids. Because as we mentioned, those little guys can get in there. And if you do have an infestation, especially if you have those little sawtooth brain beetles, make sure when you do open them up, always look. Look on the edge, make sure you don't have any of those guys waiting to fall inside. Now remember, this is just a reiteration of our trap information. Remember, they catch only males. That's going to be your most common, the sex pheromone one. You can get food attractants. Now these ones are mostly for beetles. The beetles are mostly attracted by food, and that will attract both males and females. However, most of the time you have to get those online. You can't typically get those in your home product stores. You have to actually look for those. Look online for those. There's also some aggregation pheromones. That's actually more for cockroaches than, say, for your store product pests, but that also works. And those last two will actually attract both males and females. But as I mentioned, they can be pricey, and usually you have to go looking for them. Most of the ones that you're going to find in the store are going to be your Indian moth traps, and it'll get other moths too, related moths, almond moths, which don't happen very often. We didn't talk about those today, but there are because they're very small, but every percentage, mostly it's Indian moths. But we do also have almond moths and I never can pronounce its name. It's called an Angulma gray moth. It has this, I can never pronounce that. And sometimes the only reason why we get those every once in a while is both of those tend to be more active, say, in the cooler months. Actually, when the Indian moth tends to just hibernate in their pupa, these ones will still continue. They'll do their thing. They will be more active in the winter time. I know again, we're just reiterating. Remember, the traps will not eliminate infestation. They're going to help you detect the presence, make sure if you still have adults. They're going to help to find where the areas of infestation might be. Like, say you put your pheromone trap up put it in your pantry, but you're not getting anything. Well, where are they? Well, maybe they're somewhere else in the house. Maybe they're where the bird seed is. If you keep the bird seed in the bathroom or in the hall closet, maybe they're in the hall closet. So then if you don't find them in that trap, then you can move that trap around the house until you can figure out where they are. So that can help that way. And it can also help you assess the effectiveness of your control program. So if you have one of these situations where you had a late summer, early fall infestation, you want to make sure they're all gone. You might want to put some out in the springtime and see if you've actually eliminated, or if you're going to get more moths coming out. So now we're going to talk about fabric and paper pests. Let me see what time we got here. What time I got? Oh, I'm good for time. Okay. Oh, good. I've got enough time to finish fabric and paper pests. All right. So what's different about the fabric and paper pests compared to our stored product pests? Well, one of them is most of these guys are not attracted to lights, so we don't have to worry about that. However, that can actually be a disadvantage because now you don't see them until they don't come out, and you can't find them. Important thing number 2, these guys feed on a wide variety of fabrics, but they're always organic fabrics. And not only that, notice what's highlighted. They're animal-based organic fabrics. So if you get a homeowner that's calling up and saying they have holes in their t-shirts, their cotton t-shirts, that they think they have, carpet beetles or clothes moths, it's not going to be the case. They do not eat those things. This is what they eat. They eat wool, silk, feathers, fur, and leather. And the information on these guys, even though it's not in our store product pet, it is in that other bulletin. So it's in the bulletin 1478, the one that Dan showed you. We've got the information on these guys in there. So you can look those up online. Now, synthetic materials can be damaged if the debris is present. In other words, if you've got something in the carpet that things, falling down in the carpet, they might be feeding on those, will accidentally damage the organic fibers, or if they're going to be chewing, if they want, like say it's the backing of the wool carpet. So they're chewing through the backing to get into the wool carpet, to eat the wool carpet. So as long as you remember that, you're pretty much okay. So typically these things, so we've got that. Now they eat organic fibers. So let's see what, here we talked about our carpet beetles. All right, now typically carpet beetles are not a problem. They happen in most homes unless you have something that they really, really like. Okay, what's an example of something that they really, really like? Well, say you got a bag, decided to try a new cat food, but Muffy totally hated it. But you don't have the heart to throw it away because, well, you bought a bag of cat food. Well, maybe someday Muffy will like it, so you curl it up and stuff it in the back of the cabinet. These guys are going to find that, and they're going to eat it, and there are going to be a lot of them, because that's going to be an example of something not natural, not normally and typically found in their environment, and it's going to make the population explode. Now, the interesting thing about this is sometimes this can be an indicator species. So what happens if you have an infestation, and this actually happened, the pest control professional told me this story. He had a kitchen where he kept getting carpet beetles from one particular wall. They kept coming out in the kitchen. Couldn't find anything infested. They weren't eating anything in the kitchen that he could find. And so he put out traps to figure out where they were coming from, put out some sticky traps, and he found out they were coming from one particular wall, but he couldn't figure out what the source was. So what he ended up doing is he put one of those little cameras on one of those things in the back wall. Guess what he found back there? Close. That would definitely happen, because these guys will definitely eat dead animals. Similar, there was an animal back there. It was a rat. And it had made a big pile of dog food, one kibble at a time, and it made a huge pile of dog food back there. And the carpet beetles were feeding on it. So the carpet beetles were telling an indicator that something was off, something was happening that's not unusual. Saying there's a big pile of dog food back there. That's what they're feeding on. So sometimes these guys can be indicator species. Now they will feed on mounted animals, because they will eat dead animals. They'll eat mounted ducks and fur and things like that. So they can be a pest in that situation. But for the most part, carpet beetles do their thing. They eat the dead hair, they eat the dead skin, they eat the pollen, and they don't bother. They don't bother you. However, guess where one of the places where you find the dead skin and the dead hair and things like that? But where specifically in the house? That couch to the bed. So what happens when the homeowners see the news report about the bed bugs, and they run back to their bed and they flip the mattress over and they find the carpet beetle? What are they going to say? It's a bed bug. No, it's not. We get carpet beetles all the time. They're just doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's just a carpet beetle, not a bed bug. So it's very important to know what these guys look like, because we get them a lot, mistaken for bed bugs. So. No, carpet beetles don't do anything.
What's an example of a spirea plant?
Those are the little flowers. Although that's what supposedly they like, spirea plants, but actually at my house, they like clematis. All right, see this guy here? This is an adult carpet beetle outside, happily feeding on my clematis plant. What you can't see is that it also has about 10 friends. Carpet beetles are very common. They happen naturally outdoors. They just are. And they'll live in bird nests, feed on bird feathers. And typically, in most cases, as I said, if you have a big population, something weird is going on, something unusual source of food that they have. So we mentioned, here's the weird house beetles again. Remember what they look like, and they're different. And these guys are bigger, much bigger pests than the carpet beetle. So here's an example. All right, this is my closet. All right, this is my closet. There was a winter closet, and it was summertime, so I didn't bother to even go look in there. There's my work boot again. Remember the work boot from Indiana? It made its way to Griffin. So what happened here is I had the kitty food in there. I decided I don't want to keep the cat food in that closet anymore. When I was moving the bag, like maybe 3 or 4 kibbles fell out on the ground. All this happened because of that. Okay. The good news is, and you notice, here's those cat skins that we talked about that are typical of them, the larval skins, and these are all actually pupa. They're not larvae anymore. The good news is, I got me a dustbin and a little dust broom, and 20 seconds later, the whole thing was gone, and I never heard from them again. That was the end of the problem. Now, if this had been warehouse beetles, they would have been all over the house. There would have been no sweeping it up within 20 seconds, actually, I shouldn't say 20 minutes, 20 seconds, actually, 30 seconds. It was like, all gone, it was all gone. If this was warehouse beetles, it would have been all over the house. So that's the good news about a carpet beetle infestation. It might look really bad, but within a minute, it's all gone and you're all set, as long as there's no more source for them to feed on. So that's the good news. And here's a close-up so you can see what. There's the cascades we're talking about. Here's the little, these are actually pupa. The pupa just look like great big larvae because they just live in there. They keep their last larval skin on, so they just look like a big fat. I have some carpet beetles up here so you'll be able to see what some of them look like. So as I mentioned, usually it's find the source. In this case, there was a lady, this is a case that Dan went on. This is a lady, she had carpet beetles coming out in the kitchen, and they were coming out on the cabinets and didn't know what it was. It turned out that what she ended up doing is that they ended up cutting a hole, and the workers that were building the cabinet, somebody decided they didn't want crackers, and their rest of the crackers, and they threw them underneath the cabinet. That's where they were coming from. We had one poor lady that they built, I guess one of the workers that was building the stairs had a dog, and on the way to the work site, they got their dog a 50-pound bag of dog food and forgot about it and built it in the stairs. And you can just imagine all the just beetles everywhere. So sometimes that's all it takes. All right, closed moths. This is a lot of information. I know there's a star there. The only thing you need to remember here is that, like most stored product pests, you don't have to know all this stuff. Just remember what they like to feed on. That's what they like to feed on. Typically, this is all the same. Notice the control is very similar to what we've been talking about for everything else. Find the source, put it in the freezer, put infested items in the freezer, pretty much the same thing. Again, prefer dark, disturbed, and hidden areas. The longer you leave your sweater in the closet without looking at it and shaking it out, the longer they'll have a chance to do their thing. So the moral of the story, take your sweaters out, give them a shake, take them out, put them in the sun a little bit, air them out. You'll find that that's the same kind of thing as we had first in and first out, also applies to stored product, to fabric pests as well. Same thing for these guys. Now the interesting thing about these, this is a closed moth case. There's a hole in the bottom and there's a hole in the top. And the little larvae can come out either end and feed on either end. Not feed from either end, as I said before. I was saying, okay, wait a minute, they can feed. No, they don't feed from both their head and their tail. No, from either end of their little case there. Now you might notice and see the size of that. They're not very big. But what do we notice? This is up 5 feet on the wall. So what do we know? Closed moths are moths, which means what happens when they're going to pupate? What do they do? Like the wander, just like the Indian meal moths. The same theory applies here. The same thing applies here. Whatever they're feeding on, they could crawl 6 feet up the wall. So where you find them isn't necessarily going to be what they're feeding on. So you got to go look for that source because they're not going to be there necessarily. So here's what they look. Here's what they look like. Here's a close up. This one they pop out of their thing. So there's a head. And this particular species has 1, 2, 3 dark spaces. You don't need to remember that, but just in case for anybody's interested, that's how you tell them apart. And notice their case here is made out of whatever substrate's on the ground. These are more common in the southern part of the state. So then we have this. So here we go. Here's a typical place where you might find them. This is not my garage. But this guy, notice all the packed up stuff that was found up, up on the wall there, crawled up. So whatever it was eating, we have no idea because it crawled away from whatever it was feeding. So here's another species. Now this species is a case-making closed moth. And if you look at it, notice here's its dark head. It only has one spot, so it has a dark head and one darkened area behind its head, not the 3 that the other species has. And this one, at least this species, which is more common in our area, is nicer in that it makes its case out of whatever it's feeding on. So at least it gives you an indication of what it's eating. In this bottom case, it was feeding on a Christmas tree skirt. And you might see a little piece of glitter in there that incorporated. And the one at the top there was feeding on Peruvian rocks. So, this case, at least, it might not be where they are, but if you take a look at the color, you might be able to figure out what it's eating, and that might help you a little bit in finding the source. Now, the interesting thing to note, both of these species don't feed right on the item. They might be underneath, they might be behind, but they don't necessarily live on the item. That means just because you take the item out and shake it and put it, get it clean, and then put it in a box with repellent, and the repellent only mothballs and things like that only work if there's not critters on it already. So they have to. It only repels. It does not kill. So if you put a sweater with critters on it in a box of mothballs, they're just going to keep eating it. So, but you also have to remember that they might be on the wall, they might be on the shelf, they might be on. You have to clean the entire area around it because they're not just on the item. They might be feeding underneath or behind or above. Also, you always have to look. So here's an example. Here's what it looks like. It's feeding on. It's feeding on. And this one, as you can see, it's made its case out of this. It's feeding on a wool carpeting here. So that's what it does. That's what you're going to look at. Let's see. But then every once in a while, you get a poor guy. This one didn't really have much to eat, so it just made its house out of a big bunch of fluff. So that could also happen. And it just looks like a big walking thing of fluff. So that one didn't really have very much to eat. You try to give it a feather to eat, but anyway, there's its head, as you can see, sticking out the thing of fluff. So and here's what the adults look like. They're going to mate. They're very shiny, buff-colored, tiny little things, kind of silvery colored. They don't like lights. They're not going to fly. You're not going to see them necessarily. This is an example of what they might eat. And this is Dan's turkey there. So he keeps a monitoring thing there to make sure that it doesn't eat anything. They might also eat. Here's a wool cap. Here's an example of a baseball cap that they will feed on. They'll eat on things that are wool. And so what do? You can get pheromone traps. So that's what you can. Now they're not necessarily cheap, but if you have something that you don't. Expensive. If you got a bunch of mountain animals, you don't want them to. If anything happened to them, it's probably worth it to look online and get a thing. And they will go it'll catch them very quickly. Very quickly. It doesn't take very long at all. You'll know whether there's things there or not. All right. The last two we got silverfish. Silverfish don't happen very often. The only thing you need to remember about silverfish is that they can be long-lived and they're an indicator species. Usually if you have silverfish, you're going to have silverfish somewhere where there's humidity. And I'm almost done. And the same thing is going to be the case. And these guys are in that bulletin. So all the information we talk about silverfish and what they do. Most of the cases, the interesting thing about these guys, not only can they live up to 7 years, but they can still molt after they become an adult, which is very unusual. Most insects, once they become an adult, they never molt anymore. These guys can continue to molt even after they become an adult. And that might be because they're kind of, my theory is that they're very, they're delicate. So if you're going to live for a long time and your outer skin isn't very hard, then you better have a way to make a new one, or you're not going to live very long. So that's probably why they're so long-lived. And the last one we have are book lice. Again, the main thing to know is, again, an indicator species. These guys can only survive if the humidity, if the relative humidity is greater than 50%. So if you have a bunch of these, there's something wrong. Maybe you have a leak in the wall. Most of the bad cases we've had of these have been, say, homeowners that have either had a leak, or it's been what I call a construction accident. In other words, while the home was being built, we had one poor lady, the home was being built, it rained. Instead of the guys allowing it all to dry out before, they wrapped it all in the tie deck, and all that water was trapped in there. And so when the water was trapped in there, these guys came up. There really isn't any way to get rid of these guys with pesticides because they multiply so quickly. So, and they're back in the wall. So one, you can't reach them very well. Two, they multiply quickly. So any kind of pesticide would be short-lived. basically what you had to do is get out a bunch of humidifiers, dump dehumidifiers and dump them and dump them and dump them and dump them until finally it was dry enough that she didn't have them anymore. So sometimes these can be an indicator species. Not only might it indicate a leak, it might also indicate that you might not have enough ventilation in the room is too closed up. That could be another thing. So, of course, fix the leaks and increase the ventilation and use a dehumidifier, basically. And these guys can show up in the tens of thousands. I mean, they're tiny little things, itty bitty bitties, but they could be, when you have tens or 100,000s of them, it doesn't seem like they're that small. Okay, any questions?
Let's give Lisa a big hand. Every word from both speakers on the test. Go on, read those publications.
Anybody who wants to see the live critters, I've got some up here. You can come take a look.
Critter show. Come on up and see. And if you would like to head up, I know you got other stuff going on. There's some more seed packets at the back door. Please take them because they're not listed in my garage, and my husband started seeing that stuff. I will see you guys on Thursday. Do all of your reading. Don't sweat this. You'll know from last time it's not to be sweated. And ladies on drink. Stay for tomorrow for Thursday, and nobody else bring you lunch because we got that covered for you.